The Halloween movies are home to some of the most memorable horror characters. Some are quite revered and others are, well, a little offbeat. So in this video, we are counting down the top 10 and bottom 10 characters of the entire Halloween franchise. Happy Halloween, Scream Team! Zach Cherry here. Guys, I started this channel because I'm a huge horror geek, and if you're like me, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on those bell notifications so you can stay up to date with all my latest videos. As always, the two main things you need to know for this list are, firstly, spoiler warning. If you haven't seen all of these movies, you're gonna have a bad time. Secondly, this is a subjective list. You might hate my opinion, and that's alright. So with that in mind, toss this video a thumbs up and maybe in the comments down below to let me know who you think are the best and worst characters of the Halloween franchise. In 10th place, starting off with the worst, is Will Brennan from H2O. Will is on my list because he is basically the biggest fuckboy of the entire franchise. Yeah, we could have considered Bud, Brady, or Mike, but at least those characters either knew they were full of shit or had some redeeming qualities. As a counselor, Will can lend you a sympathetic ear, but then the nice guy facade peels away and we see that he's only interested in one thing as he aggressively tries to get some action from Laurie, even though she told him she just needed to get through the day. And when she finally acquiesces and allows him to come over so she can unload her traumatic past experience, he responds to her with this.
Well, that's sucky.
And from that point on, it's just a downward spiral. After insisting everyone else remain calm and telling Laurie that she's overreacting, who's the first person to panic and fire a gun? That's right, this asshat. But now alternating to the best characters, in 10th place is going to be Nurse Marion Chambers. I think the most apt way to describe her is that she's kind of Loomis's Gal Friday. I don't even know why I love this character as much as I do, but she's so iconic. I guess it's because her only defining traits are that she's sarcastic and smokes excessively. She doesn't even really do a whole lot in the movies in which she appears, but has a very understated presence in them. She can also put up a fight, and if there's one thing I'm grateful for with this retconned timeline, it's that she could come back and maybe get some redemption for her ill-timed demise. In 9th place for the worst characters is the entire cast of Dangertainment. Yeah, okay, so this is a cheat because this is 6 people, but honestly, they're all so bland that I think combined their personalities barely make up one whole. These aren't even characters, they're just archetypes, and not even well-conceived ones at that. You would think that a burgeoning internet reality series would make an attempt to cast a group of individuals who were at least entertaining to watch, but it's one thing to be bad and it's another thing to be bad and boring, and that is mainly what's going on with this group. And can we talk about Sarah specifically, because not only was this insipid excuse for a final girl supposed to be the next Laurie Strode, but according to Freddie, she was the creme de la creme of his cast, and I'm just thinking, in what fucking reality? There's this whole setup where she wanted to drop out of the show because even she thought she was boring. They could have made her want to drop out because she was having trepidations based off of some sort of gut instinct or fear that Michael would return. But no, she literally just wanted to drop out because she's milquetoast. In 9th place for the best characters, and because I know how you all love when I push my Season of the Witch agenda on you, is Connell Cochran, played by the late great Dan O'Herlihy. As the primary antagonist from Halloween 3, this evil toymaker is definitely one of the more underrated villains of 80s horror, which is a shame because his diabolical scheme really is the most sinister. But they could have easily made this a one-note character, with his only defining trait being his obsession for world domination. And instead, this is all hidden behind a very warm, benevolent facade, almost as if he could pass for your grandfather. And despite how evil he is, I find myself very endeared to him for that reason alone. In 8th place for the worst characters is Buddy Cupford Jr. I just want to preface this one by saying that of this worst list, there is varying criteria for what would land a character on it. You could be boring, you could be annoying, or you can just be a really awful person. And I don't want to say this kid deserved what happened to him, but I can't say I was really upset about it either. He's basically the horror movie equivalent of Veruca Salt, just being a bratty little menace and feeling entitled to whatever he wants. But mostly he's on here because this list needs some variety, and I'm sure you could make a case place for Lonnie Elam, or those nasty kids who bullied Jamie, since Buddy was only just a dick to his parents, but he is the most memorable of all those kids, so I gotta go with him instead. In 8th place for the best characters is again a cheat because this is a twofer, but I'm gonna have to go with Vicky and Julian from Halloween 2018. I feel that these two characters and the chemistry that they share was such a missed opportunity to not have developed into a larger story thread. I probably would have loved this movie so much more if these two actually felt like they weren't just part of some vignette that bridged the action together. There's a lot of attempts to bring comedy into this, and these two were the only ones who made it feel natural. I actually connected with them on an emotional level, so I felt really bad for what ultimately happened. Their presence in 2018 was the most genuine part of the movie, and the only characters who really stood out to me other than Laurie. In 7th place for the worst characters, which again is another twofer, but probably not one you expected to see on this list, is Morgan and Pamela Strode. Yes, the non-characters of Laurie's adoptive parents. This is of course only considering any timelines which include Halloween 2 and beyond. Because if we're just taking into account the original and the 2018 reboot, there's nothing controversial about Laurie's father tasking her with dropping the keys off at the Myers house, as in this particular universe, she's not adopted and therefore not related to Michael. But considering Laurie's lineage and everything that the Strodes knew about it, why the fuck would he want her to go anywhere near that house? It just feels really strange. But then you have the mother, and holy shit, I don't know for anyone who is adopted, but what kind of a person says this to their child?
I'm not your mother.
Furthermore, where were they all night? They didn't show up at the hospital the next day. Laurie presumably had to go through that aftermath all on her own. We knew they were at the same party getting loaded with Dr. Nixter, but then where did they go after? Certainly not home. Was this a swingers party? Like, how did they not hear about anything on the news or from other people? No wonder Laurie faked her death. She probably wanted to get the hell away from these miscreants, who I can only imagine if they were this negligent during the worst day of their daughter's life, that they had probably already ruined her childhood pretty bad before we even got to this point. In 7th place for the best characters is Dr. Dan Chalice from Halloween 3. What I love about this guy is that he's just a random civilian who gets caught up in this sort of spy horror caper for the sole reason being that he would rather run off with a 6-pack of beer and a girl half his age than spend time with his own children. Sure, he had a shred of curiosity about the murder-suicide of his patient and the mysterious connection it had to the Silver Shamrock masks, but let's face it, he just wanted to get drunk and bang girls, and it makes him such a uniquely flawed, reluctant hero. Of course, he is played by genre veteran and frequent Carpenter collaborator Tom Atkins, which automatically saves him a spot on this list. In 6th place for our worst characters is John Strode. It should be noted that this is a character who is, for all intents and purposes, on my worst list because he's a douchebag. But just because he's a douchebag doesn't necessarily mean I hate him in this movie. As a matter of fact, I quite enjoy this character for being somewhat of a secondary antagonist. So in that regard, he's more so a character that I love to hate. And that's a quality I can't really attribute to the other worst characters on this list, as I'm either apathetic or just full-on loathe them. But because this movie allows us to root against the tyranny, bullying, and questionable incest, depending on which cut of the film you are viewing, any emotional investment we have here is paid off with his more than well-deserved comeuppance to the point of overkill. In 6th place for the best characters is Sheriff Lee Brackett. However, the one from the Rob Zombie timeline. And this is in no way a shot against Charles Cyphers as the original, as he's spectacular in his own right with what he brought to that role. But I'm gonna say that this is the rare instance of Rob Zombie taking creative liberties that actually pay off, since it's still elaborating and expanding on John Carpenter's source material, but harnessing that raw, untapped emotion that we initially saw from the character. And most of that can be attributed to Brad Dourif, who, even if you don't respect him for being the voice of Chucky, which I don't know anybody who wouldn't, he is a true thespian, and one who's been nominated for an Academy Award in his lifetime, and because of that, I never expect to see anything less from him on screen. In 5th place for worst is Tina Williams. I know that she would probably be a lot of people's #1 pick in this category, more so based on how annoying they find her to be, but my problems with this character are more so rooted in how frequently she ignores her own intuition. By all accounts, Tina is on the same level of perceptiveness that Laurie Strode is. She's in tune with her surroundings. We constantly see that she's picking up on things that don't feel right to her. But rather than to logically question any consternation, she instead chooses to become distracted by her frivolous teenaged whims. So in that regard, she's more so the anti-Laurie, as she ignores the gift she is given, and in doing so, renounces her final girl card. It's a very mercurial characterization that I wish I could actually deconstruct and say there was more depth to, but I really can't find any. However, there was a more suitable final girl to wear Laurie Strode's tiara for a time, and that brings us to my 5th best character with Rachel Carruthers. Obviously, we all knew she was gonna be on this list, since she's the most beloved character according to the Halloween community, and I actually really like Ellie Cornell. She has a very warm screen presence, and I'm quite surprised that she wasn't a bigger star in the 80s considering her success with these movies. I think that if I can praise Halloween 4 for anything, it's that the Rachel-Jamie relationship is the most heart we've seen within the franchise, which wasn't present in any of the movies before, and certainly not done anywhere near as effectively since. I'm sure most of you know by now that I am a guilty pleasurist of Halloween 5, but even I will admit they squandered a good thing here. And while it was a bold move to kill her off, it's not one that particularly ever pays off for me, as she's reduced to a mere peekaboo corpse at the end for Jamie to momentarily react to. Even Tina's death was given more fanfare, so it just feels like they ultimately did her dirty. Coming in 4th place for the worst is gonna be Ronnie White, aka the deadbeat, abusive, and pedophilic boyfriend of Michael's stripper mom in Rob Zombie's Halloween universe. Objectively, this is the worst character of this list, if this were real life. He's certainly leagues worse than John Strode in terms of parental abuse. However, because he exits the movie relatively early on, we're at least not forced to sit through the entire 2-hour runtime, listening to him use terms like skull fucking. People like this do exist. I'm not gonna pretend for the sake of this list that they don't, but this is such a one-note character that his only purpose here is to bring a heightened level of trashy sensationalism. At least the other characters in Rob Zombie's entries, as unlikable as they are, show glimpses of fragility and hopefulness. Ronnie does not possess any greater depth than what we see on the surface. And because of that, this movie is telling me that Michael's evil is not inherently part of who he is, but rather a byproduct of a broken home life and this man's corruption. But in 4th place for the best characters is Jamie Lloyd, who has the distinction of being one of the youngest final girls, and single-handedly carried this franchise on her shoulders through the strange middle years. I'm not typically a fan of child actors in horror movies because most of the time they play to all the same tropes we see recycled over and over again. Jamie is subjected to some of these cliches, but when Danielle Harris gets to play the part straight, she excels in the role and brings a very naturalistic characterization. She doesn't come off like a typical horror movie child. She's just a regular young girl trying to do regular young girl things while navigating in a world that dealt her a cruel hand very early on. So we get to watch as she's forced to mature over a short period of time. And this is no knock against JC Brandy, but I think had we gotten Danielle Harris to return for the 3rd time, and also if we had gotten a more cohesive story that actually respected the character, she would have made it much higher up on this list for me. In 3rd place for the worst is Rob Zombie's Laurie Strode, particularly just where Halloween 2 is concerned. This character is just a very poorly conceived mess in my opinion. It's evident that Rob Zombie was trying to show us a different portrayal of what happens after the trauma occurs and delve into some themes of mental health, but then he doesn't actually have anything to say about them. It's done entirely exploitatively and doesn't paint a fair or accurate picture of such a person. Instead, Laurie comes off being more so entitled and quite repellent, not just for the audience, but also for the other characters in the movie. I don't want to blame Scout Taylor Compton. I don't think this was her fault. There were definitely moments earlier on, specifically in the hospital scene, where we see a glimmer of a much more realized person. So I know she is a capable actor, but then we stray too far into the bizarre, and this Laurie fails to offer any sort of tangible final girl vitality. That's not so much the case for my 3rd place choice for best characters, who oddly enough happens to also be Laurie Strode. However, the Jamie Lee Curtis original, who we all know and love. What's keeping her from placing higher up on my ranking though is a problem I have with the fact that we have 2 separate timelines, both depicting a radically different incarnation, and of the current 5 movies in which they cover, there is no consistency to her character. So because because of that, I'm gonna have to take the good with the bad. However, that will lead us to a very unprecedented ranking within the ranking. So to make things even more confusing for you, I will be listing each appearance by Jamie Lee Curtis from worst to best. Starting with 5, which will go to Halloween Resurrection. I think it goes without saying that this is Laurie's low point in the franchise. Sure, she tells us that she has been vindicated through the fact that she's no longer afraid of Michael, but then it just feels like a very lazy and unsatisfying way to try and sell this as a closure to her story. In 4th will be Halloween 2. This is actually the weakest portrayal we've seen of Laurie. I mean, she spends the entire movie drugged up and bedridden. And while at least in Resurrection she seems to be driven by something rather than away from it, I place this portrayal higher because at least we do get that iconic chase scene. In 3rd will be Halloween 2018. Like I've said before, I find this portrayal of the character to be contradictory. We're given this buildup of a very Linda Hamilton-esque soldier, but she's never in the driver's seat here. Everything that leads towards the climax is out of her control. I think she definitely looks the part. Jamie Lee Curtis disappears into the role, but that aesthetic is not enough for me to understand who this woman is 40 years later, and I feel there could have been more characterization and less exposition. In 2nd will be the original Halloween. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Laurie in this movie. After all, she is the quintessential final girl. The only reason this is 2nd is because I have more of an affinity to her portrayal in another movie, and she's also not the most interesting character within this movie. But for her best portrayal, H2O is the movie where we get to see her assume her ultimate final girl form. She drives the story and has more control over her narrative here than she does in any of her other appearances. Her pathos is felt and understood because it's a very simple and effective story, and she receives her catharsis in the end until it's all undone. But still, that was the most well-earned moment of her entire Halloween tenure. But now let's get back to the bad with our 2nd place worst character, Dr. Sartain from Halloween 2018. If you've watched my ranking video for all the Halloween movies, you will know that this character was a huge problem for me, as I feel the whole twist with him killing Hawkins and driving Michael to Laurie's was a horrible plot device which seriously undermines this entry, as well as my enjoyment of it. First of all, it made absolutely no sense. It was given very minimal setup, and it completely took away the power from both Michael and Laurie. And instead, it gives it to this character, making him an unnecessary Diabolus ex machina, as from a thematic standpoint, Laurie should have been the one pulling the strings the whole time. Yet the movie still goes into its final act with Laurie being under the pretense that this was always part of her design. It's ludicrous when you actually think about it. And also so lazy, because there were a plethora of options they had to get the movie from point A to point B, and yet they hinged that all upon Dr. Sartain. Seriously, if you take him out of the movie entirely, you've already vastly improved it. But there's no substitute for the original, as there's only one true psychiatrist for Michael Myers, and that is Dr. Sam Loomis, who takes the 2nd place spot for the best characters. I just absolutely adore Donald Pleasance. Whether he's taking a moment in his smug satisfaction of frightening a child, or using one as bait to lure his prey into a trap, this character steals every scene he's in. And unlike Laurie, there's at least a progression with each of his appearances, where every sequel he just becomes a little bit crazier, until the last one where he finally got some chill. Oh, and the monologues, you can't forget about those. They are so good. There's just such a tragic nature to his entanglement with Michael, which consumed over 30 years of his life. He is, for all intents and purposes, the Van Helsing to Michael's Dracula, and no character will better understand or be as theatrical in their convictions as Dr. Loomis was. But now we've come to the final entries for both bad and good, with my number 1 worst character of the Halloween franchise being Freddie Harris, aka Busta Rhymes in Resurrection. This was a really easy choice for me because holy crap, I cannot stand the self-righteous bullshit that this guy spouts off. First of all, what is his plan for Dangertainment? Like, what is the long-term goal? Are they just doing new episodes in the Myers house for every broadcast? Or are they finding different haunted or crime historical locations each time? He's acting as if this is a gold mine which is going to change the face of internet broadcasting, but then has contradictory arguments about how people also think reality-themed shows are boring. Pick a lane, Freddy. It's literally the only thing he he talks about, though, for the first 2/3 of the film. He has such an inflated arrogance to him, which is never even properly validated in the plot. He congratulates himself for literally doing nothing. His only defining characteristic is that he's bossy and likes kung fu. And yet, somehow, he does more mental and physical damage to Michael Myers than anyone else has ever done in any of these movies. And then he openly taunts him while believing that he's laying dead on a stretcher. And then has the hubris to flog the media for doing their jobs after he was the one person who exploited Michael the most, which also happens to make him indirectly responsible for a ton of people being killed. I mean, as far as anyone knew at this point, Michael was still at large and murdering people. There is no good sense or taste in anything that he was planning on doing with Dangertainment. Oh, and also Trick or Treat motherfucker? Seriously? But let's end this list off strong with the absolute best character from the Halloween franchise, with Paul Rudd as Tommy Doyle. No, I'm just fucking with you. It's Michael, obviously. This is a no-brainer. Michael is the face of the Halloween franchise, and Season of the Witch notwithstanding, he is the one constant variable that will forever keep this engine going, as long as they can keep making quality sequels. I want to thank my Patreon supporter, Nathaniel Fincher. If you too would like to support the channel, you can head over there and unlock bonus content made weekly. Until then, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.